On the morning of November 5, 1943, American aircraft crossed the water toward Rabaul, not to invade it, not to hold it, not even to finish it. They came in low over one of the most dangerous harbors in the Pacific, found the Japanese cruisers packed inside the anchorage, and turned the harbor into a sheet of smoke and steel. Bombs struck decks. Fuel burned. 6 cruisers were damaged badly enough that the Japanese surface fleet in that sector stopped being a serious threat almost overnight. And then the strangest part happened. The American planes left. No troop ships followed. No landing craft appeared. No Marines came running through the surf. For the Japanese officers staring at the sky over Rabaul, that was the part that did not make sense. Because every rule they had been trained to believe said a fortress existed for one purpose: make the enemy come to you, make him bleed, make him pay for every yard. But the Americans had just done something colder. They had struck the fortress, measured its reach, and decided not to dignify it with a battle. Rabaul was not being conquered. It was being erased from the war. And nearly 100,000 Japanese soldiers were about to learn that there was something worse than dying in a final charge. There was being fully armed, fully dug in, still alive, and no longer relevant. To understand why that idea was so terrifying, you have to understand what Japan had spent 2 years building. By 1943, the Pacific was not just a battlefield. It was a trap system. Island after island had been turned into a fortified tooth, airfields hacked out of jungle, coastal guns pointed toward the beaches, concrete bunkers buried under palm roots, ammunition stacked inside caves, fuel drums hidden under camouflage netting. Every strong point was supposed to do the same job: force America to fight the war Japan wanted. Rabaul was the crown jewel of that system. It sat at the northeastern edge of New Britain, with a deep natural harbor, multiple airfields, repair facilities, supply depots, anti-aircraft guns, and enough soldiers to make any direct landing look like a massacre before it even began. American planners studied it and saw the same nightmare every time. A frontal assault would mean months of jungle fighting, thousands of men hit by artillery before they reached the first line, aircraft attacking from fields cut into the island, defenders inside tunnels that could not be cleared from the air. The estimates were not clean numbers, they were warnings. A direct fight for Rabaul could cost tens of thousands of Allied casualties before the road to Japan even opened, and that was exactly what Japanese strategy wanted. The Imperial Defense Plan rested on a brutal piece of psychology. America could build ships, America could build planes, America could replace machines. But could America watch island after island become a graveyard and still keep coming? Japan believed the answer might be no, so every island was to become a blade pointed at American morale. Every beach was to become a political problem back home. Every bunker was supposed to say the same thing. This is what the next island costs, and the next one, and the one after that. That was the war Japan had prepared to fight. Then Chester Nimitz looked at the same map and asked a question that changed the Pacific. Not, how do we take the fortress, but what happens if we do not have to? Nimitz did not look like the kind of man who would break military doctrine. He was not theatrical. He was not famous for rage. He was a calm, patient, numbers-driven admiral who spent as much time with logistics as other commanders spent with speeches. But that was the point. Where other men saw islands, he saw distances. Where Japanese planners saw honor and positions and final stands, Nimitz saw fuel consumption, cargo capacity, submarine lanes, airfield range, repair schedules, and the brutal arithmetic of supply. A fortress looked terrifying from the beach. On a logistics map, it looked different. It was not just a place full of men, it was a mouth that needed rice, fuel, ammunition, medicine, replacement aircraft, spare parts, oil. And if those things stopped arriving, then the fortress stopped being a weapon. It became a cage. That was the heart of island hopping. Do not attack every strong point. Seize the islands that extend your reach. Build airfields. Control the sea lanes. Cut the supply lines behind the enemy. Then leave his best troops sitting in perfect defenses that no one is coming to challenge. It sounded insane to people raised on older military rules. You did not leave a major enemy force behind you. You did not sail past a base with tens of thousands of troops. You did not put an enemy fortress in your rear and trust arithmetic to hold it there. General Douglas MacArthur hated the idea, and his objections were not foolish. For centuries, armies had been destroyed because they advanced too far and left danger behind them. A fortress in your rear could cut your supply line. It could strike your flank. It could turn victory into disaster. MacArthur believed Rabaul had to be taken because military logic said concentrated enemy power had to be destroyed. Nimitz answered with a different kind of logic. Power is not the same as position. 100,000 soldiers cannot threaten your supply line if they have no fuel to move, no ships to ride, no aircraft to cover them, and no food beyond what is already in their depots. A cruiser trapped in harbor is not a fleet. An airfield without fuel is not an airfield. A division eating its own emergency stocks is not a reserve. It is a countdown. The Japanese had built fortresses to survive attack. Nimitz was asking whether survival mattered if the attack never came. Operation Cartwheel became the proof. The official goal was not to storm Rabaul. It was to neutralize it. Allied forces moved around it, island by island, taking the places that mattered for airfields and sea control. Woodlark, Kiriwina, Bougainville, the Treasury Islands, Cape Gloucester, then the Admiralties. Each move looked smaller than the prize. Each one made Rabaul less useful. Japanese officers could still point to the map and say the fortress was there. That was true. But its reach was shrinking. American submarines tightened the water around it. Allied aircraft moved closer. Convoys that once reached the harbor began disappearing. Ships that arrived did not guarantee survival. Ships that failed to arrive meant hunger. The raid of November 5th did not destroy Rabaul in the old sense. It damaged the cruisers that could have threatened the Bougainville landings and showed the Japanese something more disturbing than defeat. American carriers could appear, strike, and leave. They did not need to stay. They did not need to accept the fortress on Japanese terms. Then more strikes came. Airfields were cratered. Ships pulled away. Aircraft were lost faster than they could be replaced, and the very pilots Japan could least afford to spend were drawn toward a base the Americans had already decided not to capture. That was the hidden violence of the bypass strategy. It made Japan spend real strength defending fake danger. The Imperial Navy had already lost too many veteran aviators at Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, and the grinding campaigns that followed. Those men were not replaceable in the way a plane was replaceable. A factory could produce metal. It could not produce 5 years of carrier experience. When trained pilots were pulled into the defense of Rabaul, they were being fed into a trap with no decisive battle at the end. They could fight off one raid. They could survive one scramble. They could even believe they had won because no invasion followed. But every loss hollowed the Japanese carrier arm a little more. Every veteran gone from Rabaul was a veteran not available when Japan finally needed its carriers for the next decisive fight. And while Japan bled experience, Rabaul bled supplies. The numbers told the story more honestly than any speech could. A fortress that had once been fed by regular shipping began living shipment to shipment. Surface vessels became rare. Submarines made the sea lethal. Aircraft fuel became too valuable to waste. Spare parts disappeared into maintenance reports. Men who had been trained to defend the emperor with rifles and bayonets were eventually ordered to do something no warrior code had prepared them for. Grow food. At Rabaul, soldiers dug gardens where they had expected trenches to matter. They planted vegetables near anti-aircraft positions. They raised animals. They stretched rice. They repaired equipment that could not leave. The greatest Japanese base in the South Pacific had not been stormed by Marines. It had been reduced gradually and deliberately into an armed farm surrounded by water it no longer controlled. That is why the psychological damage was so severe. Japanese military culture had an answer for death. It had language for sacrifice. It had rituals for last stands. It could turn defeat into honor if the men died fighting. But island hopping denied them the one thing that gave that system meaning: the battle. These soldiers had prepared for the glorious collision. Instead, they got waiting for ships that did not come, waiting for fuel that did not arrive, waiting for an invasion that American planners had canceled inside a map room, waiting while the real war moved north and west without them. By the middle of 1944, the consequences were no longer confined to Rabaul. They spread across the entire Japanese defensive system. Truk, once the great fleet anchorage of the Central Pacific, was bombed and bypassed. Wake sat isolated. Wewak weakened. Other garrisons held beaches that no longer connected to anything important. These were still soldiers, still armed, still capable of killing anyone who landed in front of them. But that was exactly the problem. No one needed to land in front of them. Japan had poured men, guns, concrete, and ammunition into positions whose value depended on one assumption: that America would come directly at them. Nimitz had broken the assumption, and once the assumption failed, the fortresses became liabilities. They consumed resources Japan could not spare. They held troops Japan could not move. They preserved weapons Japan could not use. A strong point does not have to be captured to be defeated. Sometimes it only has to be made pointless. The proof came in the Philippine Sea. In June 1944, Japan sent its carrier force into battle against the American fleet near the Marianas. This was supposed to be the kind of decisive naval engagement Japanese doctrine had been waiting for. But the carrier war Japan wanted no longer existed. The American fleet now had radar, massed carriers, trained aviators, combat air patrols, better coordination, and a production base behind it that Japan could not match. Japan had carriers. What it did not have enough of were veteran pilots. The men who might have given those decks teeth had been lost across the long attrition of the Pacific, including the futile defense of places the Americans were learning not to attack. The result was so one-sided American pilots gave it a name that sounded almost cruel: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Hundreds of Japanese aircraft were destroyed. Carrier decks that had once projected terror across the Pacific became floating symbols of something irreparable. Japan had lost not just planes. It had lost the ability to rebuild experience. By the time American forces landed on Saipan, The island-hopping campaign had done more than move the front. It had changed what Japanese strength meant. A fortified garrison was not automatically power. A fleet without trained crews was not automatically danger. A defensive perimeter was not automatically defense. If the network connecting it all could be cut, then Japan's strongest pieces could remain on the board and still lose the game. That was Nimitz's revolution. He did not need to knock over every piece. He needed to make the board itself stop working. But every strategy has a limit, and one Japanese general found it. Tadamichi Kurifaya arrived on Iwo Jima understanding something many commanders had refused to accept. He was not going to win. He was not going to save the island. He was not going to throw the Americans back into the sea. But he had studied the bypassed garrisons. He had seen what happened to Rabaul. He had seen what happened when Japan built a perfect fortress in the wrong place. And he understood the one condition that changed everything. Some islands could be ignored. Iwo Jima could not. It sat on the route between the Marianas and the Japanese home islands. American B-29 bombers flying toward Japan passed near it. Fighters and warning stations there mattered. Emergency landing fields mattered. Radar and air control mattered. This was not a fortress the Americans could simply starve and sail around. This one sat inside the machine of the air war. That meant Kuribayashi did not have to lure the Americans in with pride. Geography would do it for him. So he built a defense designed for the strategy that had beaten Japan. No dramatic beach stand, no glorious early destruction, no mass banzai charge that would let American firepower solve the problem in one terrible afternoon. Kuribayashi moved the island underground. Miles of tunnels ran through the volcanic rock. Caves became firing rooms. Command posts dropped below the reach of ordinary bombardment. Positions were designed to support one another so that clearing one hole did not clear the ground around it. The Marines could silence a cave and still be shot from the next ridge. They could take a slope and find fire coming from behind them. They could call in naval guns and watch shells tear up the surface while the real defense waited below. Kuribayashi had taken the lesson of Rabaul and inverted it. If the Americans can skip fortresses that do not matter, then build the one fortress they must attack. If they can use time as a weapon, make time cost them blood. If they can refuse the old battle, force a new one on ground they cannot avoid. On February 19, 1945, the Marines landed on Iwo Jima. At first, the beaches were too quiet. That silence was not mercy. It was discipline. The first waves pushed inland across black volcanic sand that swallowed boots and wheels. Then the island opened, mortars, machine guns, artillery from positions the bombardment had not killed. Fire came from places no one could see. The sand made digging hard. The slopes offered little shelter. The Marines were not fighting a line. They were fighting a buried system. In the first day, American casualties were staggering. The battle that planners had hoped might be settled quickly became a yard-by-yard struggle against rock, smoke, flame, and hidden steel. Flamethrowers went forward. Demolition teams crawled toward cave mouths under fire. Tanks fired point-blank into black openings. Engineers sealed holes only to find the tunnel system breathing somewhere else. Every position had to be found, then reached, then burned out, then checked again. The famous flag on Mount Suribachi rose early enough that Americans at home could believe the battle's symbolic moment had arrived. But on the island, the worst fighting was still ahead. The northern defenses remained. The tunnels remained. Kuribayashi remained. For weeks, The Marines pushed through a landscape that looked less like a battlefield than the surface of another planet. No jungle canopy, no villages, no cover except shell holes and wreckage. Just ash, sulfur, rock, and guns that seemed to grow back after every bombardment. By the time organized resistance ended in late March, the cost was almost beyond the scale of a single island. More than 26,000 American casualties, nearly 7,000 dead, most of the Japanese garrison killed, only a small number captured. For the first time in the Pacific Amphibious War, American casualties exceeded Japanese casualties. That was Kuribayashi's achievement, not victory. Proof. He proved that island hopping could be beaten in one circumstance: when the island was too important to bypass, and the defender refused to die in the old predictable way. That lesson reached far beyond Iwo Jima. American planners were already studying the invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, Kyushu, Honshu, millions of civilians, thousands of aircraft, coastal defenses, caves, suicide boats, kamikazes, soldiers, militia, and civilians prepared to resist on ground that could not be bypassed because it was the homeland itself. After Iwo Jima and then Okinawa, the casualty estimates became more than staff work. They became a shadow over every decision. If one volcanic island could cost that much, what would Japan itself cost? That question helped define the final months of the war. It sat behind debates about blockade, bombing, invasion, surrender terms, and the atomic bombs. Nimitz had built a strategy that saved countless lives by refusing unnecessary fights. But Iwo Jima showed him the other side of the equation. The bypass strategy could starve a fortress. It could isolate a fleet base. It could turn thousands of soldiers into prisoners of geography. But it could not make every place irrelevant. Some ground was connected too deeply to the next phase of war. Some islands were not obstacles, they were keys, and keys have to be taken. That is why the island hopping campaign remains one of the most important strategic ideas in modern military history. Not because it was simple, because it changed the question. For centuries, commanders asked how to break the enemy's strongest point. Nimitz asked why the strongest point had to be fought at all. That single shift turned Japan's defensive genius against itself. The more elaborate the bunker, the more tragic it became if no one attacked it. The more troops packed into a strong point, the more food it consumed while contributing nothing. The more perfect the fortress, the more completely it depended on the enemy agreeing that it mattered. Rabaul was built for the battle that never came. Iwo Jima was built for the battle that could not be avoided. Between those two islands lies the hard truth of the Pacific War. Strategy is not just choosing where to fight. It is choosing what your enemy no longer gets to decide. Japan prepared for a war of heroic collisions. Nimitz fought a war of selected absences. He attacked supply instead of pride, range instead of symbols, networks instead of walls. And for hundreds of thousands of Japanese soldiers left on bypassed islands, the defeat did not arrive as one final explosion. It arrived as silence, a radio with fewer orders, a harbor with fewer ships, an airfield with planes that could not fly, a rifle cleaned every morning for an enemy who had already sailed away. The strongest fortress in the Pacific was not destroyed because America finally found the courage to storm it. It was destroyed because one admiral looked at it and understood the most dangerous possibility in war: that the enemy's greatest preparation may only matter if you accept the question he built it to answer. Nimitz refused, and across the Pacific, fortress after fortress remained standing while the war moved past them.